Welcome to the August edition of the Essential GovCon Brief, episode 13. I'm Patrick Burns and joined by my co-host, Jeremy Camacho. Each month, we'll review legal developments affecting government contractors and discuss what those issues can mean for your business. This month, we have two significant topics. First, we'll cover GAO's proposal to Congress pursuant to the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2025, which could result in a more stringent pleading standard for all protests filed with the GAO, Government Accountability Office, and potentially introduce cost recovery measures against unsuccessful protesters.
And second, we'll examine a recent decision from the Court of Federal Claims allowing Siemens Government Technologies to move forward with a claim for nearly $3 million in bid preparation costs after a canceled Army Corps of Engineers savings project.
Both developments highlight how procedural and contractual rules can directly impact the risks and strategies for contractors. So we'll begin this month with a development from the Government Accountability Office that could change how bid protests are decided.
So this one stems from the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2025. Congress directed the GAO, working with the DoD, to prepare a proposal covering three specific areas. First, whether the GAO should adopt an enhanced pleading standard before a protester gains access to the agency's records. Second, whether the GAO could develop cost benchmarks, both for the protest impact on DoD and the GAO, and for any lost profits experienced by the winning contractor. And third, whether there should be a process for an unsuccessful protester to reimburse those costs.
This could substantially change the threshold to make it past the initial pleading phase, the GAO. So the GAO already has a threshold requirement. Every protest must contain a detailed statement, factual and legal grounds, and those grounds must be legally sufficient. It certainly can be a challenging threshold to satisfy depending on the nature of the procurement. And many protests are dismissed at the beginning stage.
So currently the GAO, the decisions are kind of all over the place. Sometimes they state that allegations or evidence can be enough. Other times they state that bare allegations are not sufficient. That inconsistency has created an uncertainty for contractors as to what exactly they need to do in order to prevent their case from getting bounced early.
And Congress and the GAO recognize this inconsistency. So GAO, in response to the congressional inquiry, is proposing to make the standard explicit, and protests would have to include credible allegations supported by evidence that, if uncontradicted, would demonstrate a likelihood of improper agency action. This would be a significant shift from the current standard in requiring more factual support up front. The GAO would apply it to all protests. Often, the protester doesn't have all of the evidence necessary to assert a viable protest. So this would certainly hinder some otherwise legitimate protests from proceeding forward.
The goal here for them is to eliminate ambiguity, ensure that only protests with a reasonable factual foundation go forward. And it gives the GAO the ability to resolve factually or legally insufficient protests quickly. That, the GAO believes, will help them meet their statutory requirement to resolve most protests within 100 days.
So turning to the second and third congressional requests, which are the cost benchmarks and possible fee shifting, GAO concluded that these cost benchmarks aren't currently feasible. Department of Defense doesn't track any litigation costs for its protests or the profit impacts on awardees when the contracts are delayed. And so without that data, the GAO cannot create any fair or accurate reimbursement formulas based on that request.
Yeah, the GAO over the last decade have noted their protests have dropped overall by 32%, and for the DoD specifically by 48%. On average, fewer than 2% of DoD procurements are protested in any given year. Against that backdrop, the GOA cautioned Congress that requiring losing protesters to pay costs could discourage legitimate challenges, particularly from small businesses, which account for more than 60% of protests.
Despite those concerns, the GAO did outline two possible approaches if Congress decides to move forward. The first would be for the agencies to include a clause in contracts to recoup or withhold profits when an incumbent contractor's protest is dismissed as legally or factually insufficient. This is aimed at addressing situations where incumbent protests primarily are asserted to extend the period of performance.
The second option would be to authorize the GAO to require an unsuccessful protester to reimburse both DoD and the awardee for their costs. But the GAO emphasized that this could only be done on a case-by-case basis, with the parties seeking costs having to prove both that reimbursement is warranted and the actual amount of the costs. That would require significant statutory changes and a whole new accounting process at the DoD.
For contractors, the practical takeaway is twofold, essentially. First, if the enhanced pleading standards adopted, the sufficiency of the protest filing will matter more than ever. Contractors will need to identify and document factual support before the protest is filed. Generally, best practice at present, even with the current standard, but it will matter certainly significantly more with these more stringent standards. Certainly, bare allegations will not be enough under the more stringent standards if those are adopted. So, and those of you who have protest experience know that if a protest is viable, documents received from the agency during the protest play a vital role in strengthening the protest grounds and potentially add new allegations. So the proposed changes would certainly add a big hurdle to reaching that step.
And second, while the fee shifting is not in place yet, it's being discussed seriously in Congress. But there are those practical barriers that the GAO pointed out. But if it moves forward, the financial calculus of whether to protest could change, particularly for incumbents or larger businesses. Even without formal benchmarks, the potential for cost liability could become a strategic factor in protest decisions.
All right, so that concludes our first topic. Certainly a complicated development with potential long-term implications of how protests are decided, and certainly could have a chilling effect on asserting protests. So on to the next topic.
So this case stems from a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers energy savings project at an Air Force base in Germany. This was Siemens Government Technologies. They had an umbrella energy savings performance contract through the Department of Energy, which made them eligible to compete for task orders for federal agencies.
In 2015, the Corps selected Siemens to develop this Air Force project. And over the next several years, Siemens prepared the preliminary assessment and multiple investment grade audits, certainly a large cost to them. The project was intended to reduce energy consumption, increase reliance on renewable sources. But along the way, Siemens says the Corps' handling of the procurement created serious problems.
One of the major issues was the applicability of a treaty between the U.S. and Germany, known as ABG 75, that can require the use of unionized German labor for U.S. military construction projects in Germany. Siemens themselves raised the question early on, and the Corps agreed to seek clarification from the German authorities. But Siemens says the Corps delayed that inquiry for more than a year. When they finally did meet with German officials, they were told that ABG 75 did apply and that the project as structured violated the agreement.
Siemens also alleged that the Corps failed to provide critical energy usage data for the base, changed the audit format requirements midstream, and even asked Siemens to prepare additional audits after the treaty became clear, all before ultimately canceling the project. And so at that point, Siemens had incurred nearly $2.9 million in preparation costs.
Yeah, and to recover those costs, Siemens sued under two theories. First, a breach of its express umbrella contract, arguing that the Corps abused its discretion by refusing to reimburse proposal and audit costs despite a contract clause allowing for reimbursement. Second, a breach of the implied duty to treat bids fairly and honestly, based on what Siemens says was arbitrary and unreasonable conduct during the procurement process.
So in response to Siemens' complaint, the government attempted dismissal and argued the claims were barred by the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, or FASA. And for those who don't know, FASA sets a certain monetary threshold for protests and generally requires task order-based protests to be filed before the Government Accountability Office, which is not the case here.
Yeah. The court disagreed with the government. It found that Siemens was not challenging the issuance or proposed issuance of a task order, which is what the FASA bar applies to, but was instead seeking a purely monetary remedy for wasted preparation costs. The court also held that Siemens had plausibly alleged an abuse of discretion under its express contract that stated a valid implied contract claim to have its bid fairly considered. I've encountered this claim myself, where the Court of Federal Claims found a breach of contract claim against the government for failing to exercise an option. They found that claim was a viable claim for abuse of discretion. The court again affirms the viability of that claim here.
And so the case will proceed. This is not the end of the matter, but the preliminary pleading stage. But there is an important takeaway for contractors. While recovering bid preparation costs is generally rare, it is possible in circumstances where the agency's conduct is arbitrary, capricious, or in bad faith. Legalese for improper. And this is particularly the case where the work performed turns out to be for a project the agency knew or should have known was not viable.
So it's a reminder to agencies and contractors tracking large, complex projects that unresolved external factors like treaty obligations or regulatory approvals, they can have a major impact if they aren't addressed early.
All right, so that's all for the August edition of the Essential GovCon Brief.
Yeah, today's discussion showed how procedural rules and agency conduct can have a major practical and financial consequence for contractors. The GAO proposed an enhanced pleading standard that could require more factual support for filing a protest. And any future toward applying fee shifting could alter the protest landscape.
And the Siemens decision reminds us that while recuperation cost is rare, courts will consider it when a contractor can show that the agency's action were unreasonable and led to a significant wasted effort.
So we'll track both developments closely along with other changes that affect how contractors compete for and protect federal business.
Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next month with more insights into the world of government contracting.